We're living through a very exciting cultural transformation. What social media is doing is breaking up hierarchies of expertise and networking it. Well, there's actually a guy named Trapper Jack out in Montana. I think he lives in a cave, but he's sure smart on that Twitter, and I follow him. What? Clinical psychology, clinical disorders and treatment. Narcissism, schizophrenia, avoidant personality disorder, motivational systems, how our personality and self are structured. Self-actualization is just, I gave it 110%, I'm calling it good, I'm hitting the locker room. When people go out in the world and get hit by that fire hose of information, they'll be able to make sense out of it. There's a very, very strong social pressure on having shared views of reality. That woman on the airplane, that person back there is not real. We only need to be accurate enough to survive and reproduce. Cognition and perception, basically how we make sense of the world. Hey, Keith, support this war. Well, that seems like a good-looking expert. I kind of support the war. Or you look and go, well, that's some unattractive loser. I don't like them. I'm not going to support the war. The more good information that's out there, the better people are able to function in this complicated information world we live in. What is psychology? What is the field of modern psychology? What is academic psychology? Psychology comes from two words, psyche, which means soul, it's the ancient Greek word, and logos, which is the rational study of. So essentially what we're doing in psychology is the rational inquiry or study of the soul. Now you might say, well, really? Are you really sitting there in your lab and trying to weigh souls? You have people before they die, you're like, this 8 lost 6 ounces, that's this. No, we're not really studying the soul like that. What we're trying to study is kind of the human condition. How we see ourselves, how we perceive the world, how we make sense out of the world, how we form relationships with people, how we organize ourselves into groups, how all the machinery works of our visual system, our perceptual system, our cognitorium, if that's even a word. So we're just trying to figure out the human condition. Modern psychology is massive. It's a massive field. I work in a building and you'll go to usually upstairs, they've got somebody working with rodents, you know, they do stuff with rodents because that's where you can get the hoods to vent out the roof. Down in the basement, there's usually a clinical facility where you're doing clinical work because that's where you have enough room for a clinic. And so everything in between. So we're dealing with a lot of stuff in psychology. The field of psychology has been around about 150 years. And I'll give you more history than you ever want to know. So it's been around a long time. The roots of modern psychology are primarily coming out of medicine, physiology, and philosophy. So imagine a bunch of physicians who were into philosophy trying to figure out the mind from looking at the body. And that's kind of what started it. It goes back to that. Right now, I imagine today there's probably 100 studies published in psychology. Like literally, if you were on Google Scholar looking at all the public publications coming out, you're like, there's probably 100 papers coming out today. So they're just massive, massive amounts of information. I'm going to give you the basics. Psychology's roots go back to ancient Greek philosophy. And I always like starting at the beginning because if you start at the end, it's just a mess. If you start at the beginning, you can see the path. But a lot of our ideas go back to Plato. They go back to Aristotle, some of the ancient Greeks like Hippocrates or Galen, I guess it's Roman too, the ancient medical physicians. Where I like to think of the root of psychology is Plato's allegory of the cave. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but it's sort of this classic story, an allegory in ancient philosophy. It goes something like this. You imagine a group of guys, they could be women too, in a cave. They're chained up so they can only look straight ahead. Everyone's chained up. They can only look one direction. And what they see on the wall are shadows from puppets that are behind them or from machines that are behind them. But all they see on the wall are shadows. And so what they do when all they're doing is staring at shadows is they build a whole story of a world of shadows. They go, this is how the shadows work. This is what they do. This is the story. This is how these things make sense. So imagine you're in this cave and you're looking at shadows. You're like, this is the world. Everything's cool. And one day you turn around. You kind of break your chain out and you look around. You're like, wait a second. This is weird. And you turn around and you go, oh my God, there's all these machines back here, these giant metal puppets. They are not shadows. The world isn't shadows, it's metal puppets. And behind that puppet's a guy with a big fire. That's weird. I can barely see the fire. And you crawl out and you go, man, the world isn't what I thought. It's a world of machines and fires. And then, this is Plato's story, so it just keeps going. Plato says, imagine you get to the fire and you look up and you go, oh my goodness, there's something outside the cave. And you start crawling out of the cave and you get up there and it's so bright you can't even see. And you look at the grass and you start to see the grass. You go, whoa, grass, this is amazing. I can't believe it. And you stay up on the earth for a little while and your eyes adjust and pretty soon you can actually see the sun. You go, whoa, I didn't imagine anything like this was possible living in my little shadow cave with all my shadow cave buddies. So then Plato says, now go back to your buddies in the cave. So you crawl back in the cave, you get back, they chain you back up, you're looking at the shadow puppets again. What do you think? Well, you think they're shadow puppets. You don't think it's the same thing. It's not the world you thought it was. You go, oh, what I thought was the world is just a pale illusion. What I see is just a thin, narrow illusion of reality. That's weird. So you go to tell your buddies, you're like, God, you guys don't know, but what we're seeing is just shadows, and there's really a sun out there, and I can't even describe it to you because it's so massive and big, you wouldn't even believe it. And you tell your friends that, and they look at you and go, you're a frickin' lunatic. We're going to put you to death to help us relax. Sort of Plato's story, right? Or Socrates' story. So what this story captures is so much about psychology. First is what we perceive in the world is not really what's in the world. What we're working on is kind of a model of the world. The other thing that it really captures is how social our psychology is. And we're talking about the study of the soul, but we're social animals. This is what Aristotle said. Humans are social animals. And so even if we see what's truth, if it doesn't align with everybody else, it's going to lead to social problems. So there's a very social component for reality. It also suggests that there's a way to grow. So it sort of captures this idea of human development, this idea that you can have one set of views when you're at a certain age, but you can grow beyond that to see something bigger, to have some adventure, to have a journey. It's really an early version of the hero's journey, and return back to people. So anyway, I love that story, but it really captures so much of what we're going to talk about in this course, which are these important aspects of the human condition. Anyway, that's Plato's cave. Great starting spot, but there's more in old psych. Another great allegory was Plato's allegory of the chariot. And this became the basis of a lot of modern motivational thought. So Plato said, imagine you're a chariot driver going through your life and you have two horses, and one of those horses is noble and it's working towards the highest aspects of the human condition. It's wonderful. And your other horse is kind of slovenly and tired and a little bit of a sloth, and it's kind of your bad horse. And that's like life, that you're kind of trying to navigate through life with these two different horses that are pulling different ways. That model of our motivation and the conflict in the human motivation, which might be the shadow and the ego in a Jungian system, or it might be, the ego and the id in a Freudian system. But that idea that we're pulled in different directions is really important for psychology. Human life is complicated. We're always in some sort of conflict. That's our nature. That's why the Buddha said life is suffering. It's just, we're built kind of weird. So that's another great one. A few other things I wanted to point out from the ancient world. One is this great insight by the Greek Heraclitus. You can't step in the same river twice. You look at the fragments, it's kind of basic, but people always say it's not the same river, it's not the same person. So there's this idea that even though we see the world as stable, our world and even ourself is always changing. It's the same river, but the material is always changing. So when we think about something like who are we, when we talk about the self in this class, the self is something that changes all the time. It's dynamic. It's like a river. It's not something stable. A lot of our modern clinical psychology has its roots in Greece and Rome. So back then they talked about things like the humors, like maybe black bile that led to something like depression. The term is melancholy, which is the term for black bile. That's the term we use for depression. We used to call it melancholia. That's what Freud called depression early on. So there's a lot of old medical work back then where they're trying to deal with mental illness, looking at the human condition. The models were older, sort of earth, wind, fire, and water. The stuff we use now is a little more complicated, but the roots are the same. So anyway, that gives you some idea that these ideas have been around a long time. In the West, when the Renaissance came around, so in the Middle Ages, you start getting the Renaissance thought, and people start asking these questions again. They start asking questions about psychology, again, from more of a philosophical perspective. One of the famous thinkers that influenced how we think about the world is Descartes. So you've probably heard this, Descartes' classic cogito, I think, therefore I am. So Descartes was trying to figure out, how do I know I'm a person? How do I know there's not some demon that's convinced me I'm real, but I'm really not real? And what he concluded in his meditation was that the idea of reflexive thinking, the idea that I can reflect and see myself as a person, gives me confidence that I'm a person. It's a little bit circular, right? So Descartes really set up a model of mind that we have in the West as something separate. We call it the mind-body split or mind-body dualism. It's probably wrong in a way, but this idea has permeated psychology a great deal. We think of ourselves as our mind is separate from our body, though, in psychology, we're kind of better at that.
We also think humans are different than dogs, thanks to Descartes. Well, like humans have super minds and dogs are just kind of little minds. We have souls. I don't really think that's the case, but that kind of comes out of Descartes. So there's lots of great philosophy in the Renaissance, a lot of interest in how the mind works. You have everything from sort of idealistic philosophy, everything is an idea, to sort of more Kantian, like there's a distinction between what's out there and in here. But there's also a lot of really interesting literature that had a huge influence on modern psychology. Shakespeare, for example. People, really, Shakespeare, man? I'm like, yeah, what do you think Freud was reading? What do you think all those guys, they were all reading Shakespeare. They were reading Goethe. They were reading lots of great literature. They were reading Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. They were sort of understanding the world that way. So something like in Shakespeare, the famous scene in Hamlet, where Hamlet is wondering if he should, kill his uncle to revenge his father's death? I always mess these stories up. And he says, to be or not to be? That's the question. It's this idea of how to live. In Freud's model, that was the Oedipal conflict, which we'll talk about. So a lot of Freud's ideas are coming out of ancient Greece, like Sophocles, filtered through Shakespeare. So there's a lot of importance in literature. So you take this Renaissance thought, and all this stuff starts to cook up about the middle of the 1800s. So about the time the Civil War is happening in the US, 1850s, 1860s, 70s, the world starts to boom. There's a huge growth of science and physiology, especially in Germany, but all through Europe. Americans are getting very scientifically literate after the Civil War and the technology boom. And what you have is essentially the birth of modern psychology. So I'd say psychology starts maybe mid-1800s. I want to talk about four key figures that set the tone for what psychology is. I'll talk about the 1800s, then I'm going to go to 20th century and kind of bring you up to date so you don't fall asleep yet. But so in modern psychology, probably the foremost figure, if you ask people who really started this ball rolling, he's not my favorite guy, but he probably gets the credit for it, is Wilhelm Wundt. So Wundt was this sort of now famous German, I guess we call him a psychologist, physiologist. He was training in physiology. And what Wundt was doing was trying to figure out the structure of the mind in very kind of basic ways. For example, having people memorize things and watching how memory decayed over time. So if I remember, like I came in here today and I remembered everybody's name, and you could have just checked me every minute and you'd watch those names just slowly disappear from my mind till at the end I'm like, hey, bro, So that's memory decay. So he's interested in things like that. There's another thing, and this goes back to a researcher named Fechner, who's kind of a pre-psychologist, something called the just noticeable difference. This sounds really trivial, but it's important. So imagine you're holding two weights, and the psychologists say, is one heavier than the other?
If they're close, if it's like an ounce and a mini ounce, whatever smaller than an ounce and a gram, maybe I can't tell the difference. But if it's an ounce and a half, maybe I can tell the difference. And you can start raising weights and looking at what's called this just noticeable difference. And what Fechner realized was there's actually some math behind it. There's some physics behind that. There's a certain formula or an algorithm that allows you to tell those differences. Well, you might go, well, what does that have to do with psychology? That's just perception. But that same model, 50 years later, people applied to attitudes. Hey, maybe we can measure attitudes the same way. So that's where, and I'll talk about that in a second. I'm jumping ahead. So a lot of these really basic physiological findings translated into more complex psychological findings later on. So Wundt was working with Fechner and Helmholtz, started this first psychology lab, started training a lot of people in what we call the psychology of functionalism. Like I said, it's how to break down the mind, almost like chemistry, into parts and how they work together. It's very important. In the US, we had a little different tradition. The US psychology was founded by a gentleman named William James. He was a genius. Well, I guess every one of these people are geniuses. James grew up in Boston, had a wealthy family. His brother was Henry James, the novelist who wrote, I think, Turning of the Screw, if I get that right. I always mix that up with Taming of the Shrew, so I could be wrong. Wrote a lot of great Victorian novels. His sister Alice James was a diarist, which is kind of an art form back then. So he had this brilliant family. James was interested in all sorts of things, but his approach, rather than being structural, was much more about function. So when he was training, like basically just a young rich dude running around Boston, he was hanging out with Emerson and, Thoreau's Pond and American sort of transcendentalism. He took a cruise down to the Amazon. So he was an Amazon explorer, with some early Darwinians. So he was looking at these Darwinian ideas in the jungles of the Amazon. He was a guy who was very bold and also was sort of sick all the time. So always imagine James kind of with the vapors on a boat being attacked by monkeys. But he had these great experiences and he was willing to do it. So his approach to psychology in America became much more functional, much more adaptive. I mean, we call it functionalism, but his approach was much more, how are people built to survive in the world? Not how are we built like chemicals, but how are we built are organisms that survive. James did really interesting work. He was out there. A lot of the stuff they don't talk about anymore because it doesn't sound as good, but he was interested in the mind-body split, like Descartes. So they said, well, if people's minds exist outside their body, ghosts must be real. So he spent a lot of time hanging out with ghost hunters. So you can read about William James and like Ghostbusters. That was William James. Like legit, that's what they were doing. I don't think they found ghosts, but they were looking because he's an American. He was just going for it. James got very into religious experience. He was experimenting with psychedelics back in, 100 years ago before anybody else. He was using nitrous oxide, which was very big at the time, inducing mystical experiences in himself and others. He wrote the book called The Varieties of Religious Experience, which is the greatest American book of psychology. He did the psychology or the philosophy of pragmatism. So a very influential character. It's what the Harvard Psychology Building is named after, William James Hall. What else did William James? Another thing, just getting at this early physiology, James was in his lab, he was interested in what's called the reflex arc. So what they found out was you could take a frog leg, a dead frog, you just take a leg, hook it up, and then shock it with electricity, and it would click together like that. People were shocked, but really, we can just animate life with electricity. He goes, oh my goodness, look, a frog works like this. He developed a model of habit. So when we talk about building habits, William James built his idea of habits from the reflex arc and frog legs. What James said was like, if you work on something and develop these little patterns of behavior, you'll build them up over time like chains. And if you do the hard work when it's easy, so James would say every day do something hard. It's challenging because some days you're going to have to do something that's hard and you're going to be able to do it. So this idea of habit comes out of essentially the action of frog legs under electricity. So there's a real, the the emergence of modern psychology looking at big things out of basic physiology is very direct. And we just don't think about it so much because it's been about 100 years. So James is a huge figure. It's a father of functionalism in psychology. So we have structuralism and functionalism. The third big force in the birth of psychology is Sigmund Freud. And Sigmund Freud is what most people, and I'm a psychologist, like, are you analyzing me? And I always say no, but I always am. I'm not really. Well, I am. I got to be honest. I'm analyzing people. I can't help it. But that's where our term comes from. It's Sigmund Freud, psychoanalysis. So Freud came into psychology from a different background. He was a physician. He was a neuroanatomist. He spent a lot of time studying the neuron on a squid. And the reason was because squids have this one very big neuron that people were able to study before they could study little neurons. So there's a lot of interest in squid. So a lot of our great ideas come from squid. But he was not a chemist, but he was good enough to do that. He synthesized cocaine or isolated cocaine, and cocaine became the first modern antidepressant. And you can read about Freud giving cocaine to people and saying, hey, it worked great for a couple weeks. And then, so I shouldn't laugh, it's so horrifying. But you imagine giving people cocaine, they're like, yeah, I feel fantastic. And then they're addicted to it. And then, I think he had one friend commit suicide. I haven't read the cocaine papers in a long time. But he was a very interesting guy trying to figure out how to help people. Oh yeah, this is cool. So Freud was doing surgery. Like he was working with a guy named Fleece, and people had, mentally ill. He'd do like nasal surgery. What? Yeah, we'd work on her. No. So he had one patient he called Anna O. His names for patients were always a little different. So Anna O, her real name was Bertha Peppelheim, if I got that right. Meaning it was AO and BP. So that's how he'd make his fake names. He'd take the initials and move them back one in the alphabet. That makes sense. So Anna O, who's his patient one day, said, Freud was trying hypnosis, he was trying surgery. He said, why don't we just talk? And she developed what's called the talking cure, which is I'm going to talk about my problems and you're going to listen. And we're going to unwind them that way. So Freud is the one with really Anna who discovered modern psychotherapy. So Freud is really coming at it, the first person to come at it, the therapeutic tradition. He also has this whole model of psychoanalysis. I'll talk about some when we talk about development. It's just so big. But his ideas go back to people like Schopenhauer and Nietzsche in the philosophical tradition. So if you want to nerd out for a second, Schopenhauer was reading a lot of Vedic literature, kind of the early translations of what they might call Hindu literature back then. And he was talking about the will to life. So Schopenhauer was talking about the will to life. And then Nietzsche, who is kind of a well-known philosopher now, started talking about the will to power. These are sort of these basic drives. And Freud took those ideas and started talking about the will to life and death, eros and thanatos. So Freud's model, especially if you read his later work like Civilization is Discontents, it's about the conflict in the human condition between love and death, or love and war, or love and conflict. That's kind of it. So his model were psychodynamics because he's talking about this dynamic unconscious, part of you that wants one thing, part of you wants these, like the two horses in the chariot, except in Freud, they're kind of underground fighting. So Freud starts psychoanalysis. Talk about that for about 10 hours. I got to stop. And a fourth person that's really important in the birth of psychology was Ivan Pavlov, who's famous for Pavlov's dog. So Pavlov was a Russian physiologist. He was working on learning in animals. And what he found was, he developed was associationist learning. We often call classical conditioning. So here's how it works. You find in nature a natural stimulus and response that just exists in nature. So for example, you have a dog, I've got Killarney and Murphy, and I come home and I open up a bag of cookies, and the first thing that happens is Murphy jumps up on a chair and he starts to salivate, like literally drool. It's kind of disgusting. I love him, and he's a beautiful dog, and it's a beautiful thing, but it's a little disgusting too. Why is my dog drooling? Because he's anticipating I'm going to give him a cookie. So what's happened is the natural association between getting a cookie and drooling, which is just a natural stimulus and response, he's learned to associate that or pair that with me opening a bag of cookies. So he hears the cookies and he starts to salivate. That's associationist learning. That's classical conditioning. So it's classical. It's not based on reward. It's based on association. Operant conditioning Skinnerian's based on reward. This is based on association. Pavlov's dog was the same deal. Pavlov would ring a bell, bring a dog food, dog would salivate. He did that over and over, and pretty soon all he needed to do was ring a bell and the dog would start to salivate. That's the magic of that little link. Hey, we can just build associations on associations is the groundwork of behavioral psychology. It's why you get delta points. I mean, delta points started with Pavlov through Watson and Skinner, and now I'm fighting to get freaking delta status. Oh, it's so sad. It's just so sad. I mean, behaviorism is so powerful. It works so well that marketing people love it. But it's so intellectually dumb that I never think, sorry, I shouldn't say it, but it's not so hard. It's just simple and it works really well. So I'm always a victim of it because I never see it. I want to use this super clever Freudian stuff. And no one does that. You're just here's a token. Here's a point. I want more points. So Pavlov, and I didn't hang with a lot of behaviorists, but the few I did hang with in grad school way back when, they would tell stories that Pavlov was kind of a genius there's a story of him coming to the States to visit people and losing all his money and ending up lost on a subway and people had to track him down. I don't know if this is true. We have a lot of stories in psychology that are apocryphal stories that may or may not be true. So his story is being lost on the subway and having people have to find him because he was so smart he couldn't figure out how to pay for a subway. I mean, in academia, that's a real flex. Oh, I'm so smart, I can't even use money. I can't feed myself. I'm such a genius. But I think those four thinkers are sort of the roots of psychoanalysis, behaviorism, functionalism, structuralism. That's pretty much 1800s up to 1900s. Freud's interpretation of dreams, he wrote in 1899, but put 1900 on the date, so it sounded modern. So I think this is the late 1800s. And then we moved to 20th century psychology. What was going on? Really, it's so weird saying the 20th century. Remember the 20th century? I'm yeah, that was my whole life, the 80s. That's when I was happy. Oh my God, I do remember it. I fantasize about it every night. It's so bad. I just want to drive my VW Bug to a talking head show, just have a world that makes sense and not share it on social media because no one invented that thing yet. But 20th century is really where this modern psychology took off. So what are the forces? Well, the first big force in 20th century psychology was behaviorism. This is done by a guy named John Watson. And later B.F. Skinner, who probably people are familiar with. That's who they named the principal after on The Simpsons, Principal Skinner. What the early learning theorists were really interested in was a kind of conditioning. Instead of classical conditioning, we call it operant conditioning. But what it was doing was using strategic rewards and punishments to shape behavior. The classic way of doing this in Skinner's world was to take something like a pigeon or maybe a rat, put it in a box called a Skinner box. You'd have a light that went on and off. They'd have a thing they could peck and get a food pellet, and they would learn certain things. So they might learn, a combination of lights. If you peck, you get a food pellet. And then they change the reinforcement. So this is all about reinforcement schedules. So do you get a food pellet every time you peck? Do you get a food pellet every 3 times? Do you get a food pellet on average every 3 times, which we call variable ratio reinforcement? How does that make a difference? And what they found out was you can do massive things by changing reinforcement schedules for people. And that's Delta Airlines, but that's also gambling. So if you go to Las Vegas, which every once in a while I drive through there and walk into a casino and I just go, this must be hell. Because you see people pulling those levers just like a pigeon in a Skinner box, and they're just pulling the levers waiting for 3 cherries to come up or whatever. and feeding the thing with quarters. That's literally just a Skinner box. And it's variable ratio reinforcement in a Skinner box. It's very simple. But this stuff is very powerful. John Watson was doing this work, I think he was at Johns Hopkins. His famous case that he toured was a guy named Little Albert. So he took this little kid named Little Albert, and he trained him or shaped him to be scared of a friendly white rabbit. That was his demonstration. So what he did was with Albert, he'd be like, here's a rabbit. I love it. But he'd put a punishment with it. So like, oh, here's your rabbit. Then he'd like clang like a big bell and scare the kid. And so you hand a kid a rabbit. He's like, no. And so, sorry, I shouldn't laugh. It's so horrifying. But that was what he did. He's like, look, I can train a kid to not like something lovely and fluffy by associating it with a very scary stimulus, which is kind of bad. So he took Little Albert around in demonstrations, and then Watson got fired for having inappropriate relationships with a graduate student. I won't ask you to guess what he did then, where he took all this. Oh, he went into marketing. I'll tell you the story. So he got fired from academia and then became a marketer, just like Freud's nephew Bernays, who started all our modern propaganda. So about 100 years ago, the psychologists were already moving into our propaganda and marketing system. And I guess still got students working with social media. It's the same. There's just a funnel from psychology to manipulating the public. And Watson was one of the first. Skinner wrote some really important books. One was Walden 2. So in sort of Walden's Pond, he wrote a book called Walden 2, which was about a utopia based on manipulation and Skinnerian behavior. Basically, if you can reinforce and shape behavior in a society, can you make a utopia? So he wrote a utopian book called Walden 2. It's kind of instead of Walden's Pond, where you read the Gita and spend time with nature. In Skinner's world, you just get shaped by a bunch of scientists all the time. So it's a lot like Brave New World. And then next on the list, I think of really important early 20th century psychologist is L.L. Thurstone. So Thurstone, I kind of mentioned this before, what he wanted to do was learn how to measure attitudes. And attitude is an evaluation of something. You know, do you like me speaking? Do you like Miami? Do you like the toothpaste you use? Those are all attitudes. Do you like yourself? That's self-esteem, but that's an attitude about yourself. So our attitudes are evaluations. And what you notice about the human condition is what we do is evaluate stuff all the time. I might get it. We do it all the time. Hey, do you guys like this new shirt I got? Yes, no. Like none of you are like, I don't know. I don't have an opinion. You just got it. I really need to sit with this. Like, no, I can make an opinion real fast. I'm a human. So what Thurston learned to do was to take this idea from just noticeable differences and build these into attitude measures, which are called Thurston scales. Some different versions of that. But he learned that you can measure attitudes in very precise ways. So precise, we don't even do it anymore. Now, if I want to ask your attitude about something, I'm like, do you like this or not on a 5-point scale? I like guns, 5. I don't like guns, 5, whatever. It's simple. He did these very elaborate scales that work a little better. And anyway, that's where we started getting attitude measurement, which is in, like I said, in everything, public health, everything you do is attitudes. So that was attitudes. A little later than that, maybe in the 30s, and then you got a big boost after World War II, was the rise of social psychology. The father of social psychology is primarily in group psychology is Kurt Lewin, who was sometimes pronounced Levine, came over from Germany, again, before World War II, and some people came after, started the Institute of Social Research, I think at the New School in New York, and then they moved a lot of that to Michigan. So if you're at University of Michigan at the Institute of Social Research, a lot of that was post-war, really founded by refugees to study social behavior. And so Kurt Lewin, he was trying to use very simple social models to understand things like democracy. So he had one of his famous studies, he had 3 groups, I think they were Boy Scouts doing projects. And he said, okay, you guys be the democratic team, and you be the authoritarian team, and you be the laissez-faire team. So the laissez-faire team is the leaders like, do whatever you want, guys, laissez-faire capitalism. And then in the authoritarian team, the leader's like a little Hitler, and he's like, do this, here are the rules. And then the democratic was, hey, you guys will vote and figure out what to do, and then we'll all work together. Kurt Lewin found that they had better time and were more productive in a democratic little system. And he was very happy about that because he'd immigrated to America and a democracy. And so this is the birth of a lot of group behavior and small group behavior in social psychology, which is still going on. After World War II, you get some other interesting stuff as well. Abraham Maslow, and we'll talk about this when we talk about motivation theory, started in the 1940s in Brooklyn, New York, trying to figure out human motivation. He wrote a very famous paper on how motivation works and human needs. This started the school known as humanism. Think of Carl Rogers as another person of this. There's some older roots in California out in the Esalen Institute, like Fritz Perls. But what happened was there was this big interest in the 40s and 50s is understanding human growth and understanding the human experience. It was after the war, we're getting a little more selfish, we have a little more wealth in our nation. And people got into them, they got into themselves, and this is what turned into the 60s. And this human potential movement, the human growth movement, all that came out of 1940s psychology, especially Maslow. And then we had a couple other big changes. There is the cognitive revolution
that happened in psychology in 1960s. What kicked that off was the computer. We didn't really have computers. We couldn't really do it when computers took over in the 60s, 70s, 80s. Everybody got personal computers. I think I got my first computer, it must have been like 82 or something. Before that, people just had typewriters. Some of you remember, I'm guessing, most of you don't.
When people started getting computers, they thought, oh my goodness, the mind must be like a computer. The human mind must work like a computer. This is what we do. Whenever we have new tech, we're like, the mind must be like this. So, in Freud's day, it was like the mind must work like a steam engine. And Aristotle's like, the mind must work like a leaky bucket. And now we're like, the mind must work like AI. I'm like, no, mine's a different deal. But this is just what we do as humans. So we had this computer revolution, this big interest in cognitive psychology and how the mind worked, how memory worked, how decisions worked, how judgments worked. Stuff I'll talk about today is a lot of that kind of 80s cognitive psychology, cognitive social psychology. So that made a huge difference. And then finally, the last, and I think the biggest, and it's what the big push has been now, is in the 1990s, we developed technology to image the brain. So we call this neuroimaging. In 1970, if I wanted to see how behavior affected the brain, what I would do is take some rats, I'd have them do the behavior I was interested in, I'd kill them, I'd sacrifice them, as they call it, and then I'd slice their brain up and put their diet and put it under a microscope and see it. That's how we would see what's going on in the brain, right? So you have them do it, kill them right in the middle of it, chop their brain up and look at a microscope. That works great. The only problem is you're slaughtering rodents, and you can't do that with humans. I mean, who knows nowadays, but ethically, we can't do that. So we couldn't look at the human brain, but then we developed neuroimaging, something like a functional MRI, an MEG, an EEG, different things you can measure the brain. And what we were able to do was put people in the scanners and have them do stuff. So you can be in a scanner, you watch a screen, or you get rejected. Oh, Keith, you're rejected. How do you feel? Oh, I don't know. Let's watch your brain. I mean, so you put people in a scanner. It's not perfect. It's not as good as chopping up the brain and magnifying it, but you can have people live through this. And so the 90s became, I think it was George Bush Sr. declared it the decade of the brain, and they just started pumping money into it. So we've been pumping money into neuro research for 30 years now. I don't know how far it's gotten, but we have pretty good maps of the brain. We've got real good maps of the mouse brain now. And this stuff is, I don't know, it's going to turn into something. But I think the neuroscience is probably the hottest stuff we have right now, except for the AI working in with that, which is, anyway, I'll stop. Could be really interesting. So what does psychology look like now? It's, like I said, it's big. It is just a big field. I'm a professor. I can go talk to another professor and not have a clue what they're doing. And the way I learn stuff is I might hang out with somebody and go like, well, how does that work? And they'll just sit down, have a cup of coffee, and they'll tell me about it. Like it's just hard to keep up with everything. But one way I think is really useful to think about the field is that we start off as the study of the soul, but really we're studying all these different levels of analysis. So let's say I'm interested in something like depression. That's a normal psychological construct, or people kind of know what it is. Well, I could study depression at different levels. I can look at the role of molecules in depression. What molecule I take to make me less depressed? What is it? Serotonin? Is it something else? I can look at genetics. I can say, hey, does depression go in families? If so, what made it go in families? So I can do what they call behavioral genetics of depression. I can look at the level of the brain. I can look at the brain circuit. Oh, is it, the old model of depression? Oh, you're missing serotonin. This was never a good model, but I think people know it's not a good model now. But I can look at the synapses, or I can look at the structure of the brain, how parts of the brain are talking to other parts of the brain, or I can look at the whole structure of the brain. I can look at the white matter, the gray matter. I can do all sorts of stuff. So I can do a lot of stuff just at the level of the brain. I can go beyond that and look at the physiological system. I can look at the vagus nerve. I can look at blood pressure. I can look at pulse rate. I can use what we call physiological measures. Those used to be really hard to get. Now I can just wear an Apple Watch and get them all. I mean, I used to need a whole lab to measure these things. I can look at thinking processes. How are you thinking if you're depressed? Do you see the world as positive, or maybe you put a little negative spin on things? Maybe your prediction of the future is a little more negative than it should be, maybe more positive. I can look at the level of attitudes or values. Do you have attitudes that you're making you a little depressed? Maybe you have a little bit of pessimism about the world, and maybe that's feeding into your depression. I can look at the level of the self. So why are you depressed? Well, I don't have a positive attitude about myself. I don't like myself that much. That's part of it. Maybe it's my personality. Maybe I'm a little neurotic. Maybe I tend really well to risks in the environment, and that's what's leading to my depression. I can look at the level of the couple or the relationship. What's going on in your life that makes you depressed? Are you having struggles with your spouse? Are you having struggles with your friends? Or the problems at work? Is there something social that's causing it? Maybe what you need are new friends. Maybe your brain's fine, your molecules are fine, your genetics are fine. Everything's great. You just need a better friend because your friend sucks. So that could be a problem. I can look at the small group because all these things are different. I can say maybe your workplace is just bringing you down. And people like that. I'm in a toxic workplace. Got rid of that and I felt better. I can look at the culture you're in. I can say, is this a healthy culture? Is this a culture that supports health, that supports sleep, that supports love, that supports, people having opportunity? Or is this a culture that sort of makes people not sleep and be stressed and feel doomed all the time? Like that's going to make you more depressed. I can look at your nation state. I can look at your broader environment. So there's a whole field of environmental psychology. When we talk about seasonal affective disorder, that's essentially an environmental model of depression. When I don't get enough sun, it's the winter season, my depression goes up. So the cure for that is you get a light box at home, like a little sun, and you stand by that sun a few hours a day, and that cures it. And I can go with something even higher, maybe talk about the spiritual level, the collective unconscious. I can go all crazy Carl Jung on you, and I don't know how to do that, but maybe there's something going on bigger than that. My point is that when we talk about modern psychology now, we're dealing with things at very, very different levels of analysis, and they all work a little different. And so you can have one person really interested in the neuroscience of depression or the neuroscience of happiness. I'll make it more happy in here. It's kind of bringing it down. Neuroscience of happiness. And I can have another person in an organizational psychologist that I want to make a happy workplace. So they're both interested in happiness and the psychology, but just at different levels. Does that kind of make sense? So there's just a lot going on with levels, and it gets really confusing because we change at every one of these levels. We're just different things at every level. So that's what's going on with psychology. It's just massive, and we're studying things at lots of different levels. You can study anything you want in psychology pretty much. You don't even have to study people. There's wonderful work on rodents, but there's also wonderful work on other primates. Great work on chimpanzees, for example. So there's just lots you can do. I think what holds psychology together, what makes it psychology and not something else, is the scientific method. Is that we're all trained to do science. Well, what does that mean? It doesn't mean I'm the science. It means there's a certain way we go about defining problems, defining what we're studying, and then looking at how we're studying. The first thing we do in science is we spend a lot of time defining the variables we're looking at. So if I'm interested in something like happiness, I literally have to define what that is. If I'm interested in depression, I have to define it. And I'm not going to go into that because it's a lot of work. But usually what that means is reading the history, reading the philosophy, spending some real time thinking, like, what the heck is happiness? What the heck is depression? What the heck is psychic energy? What are these things we're talking about? Once I define it, I have to be able to measure it. I have to be able to assess it. So I have to build a scale to measure it. If I'm going to do research on depression, I need a depression scale. And we have a lot of good ones. You have Beck Depression Inventory, the California Epidemiological Survey of Depression, for example. We have varieties of these, Hamilton. So we need to develop good assessments, and we need to develop good, what they call operationalizations. I need to make this in the lab. So one thing I got interested in my own research was ego threat, which is how people respond when you hear bad, negative things. Well, what the heck is ego threat? Well, when you hear something that's negative about yourself, that's threatening to how you see yourself. How do you do that in a lab? How do you make people feel that? Well, it's hard to do, but one way you do it is you say, hey, we're going to do a test on something really important, and by the way, you just failed. Damn you! That's ego threat. That's how you operationalize it. So we spend a lot of time thinking about these things. If somebody starts talking to me about something, I go, well, how do you measure that? How do you measure a change? And they go, I can't. Well, I'm like, well, dude, you're just doing word salad. I mean, that's cool. You can do your talk stuff. I don't care, but it's not really useful. It's not science. It's just word stuff. So when you notice people discussing things, just how do you measure it? How would you know if it went up or down? You know, you're talking about all this stuff. How are we going to really get a handle on this? Science, you got to do that. And the science, the part that really makes the science work is spending time thinking about what you're measuring. It's not so much doing the stuff. It's thinking about what you're doing. So we spend a lot of time assessing things. Then what we do is once we sort of measure these things, we call them constructs, psychological constructs like depression or ego threat or happiness. I got to get some other examples here. They're popping. Creativity, that's a good one, pop into my head. I got a buddy who studies creativity. We have a lot of discussions about it. It's really complicated. Once we figure out how to measure these things, we just start to see how it goes together. So a lot of times what we do is just associationist work. This correlates with this. Yeah, people are happy, spend time outdoors. Oh, that's interesting. They correlate. So we do a lot of correlational work. And then if we want to get a little more sophisticated, we try to do experiments. So instead of just saying, hey, it seems like people are outdoors are happier, I'm going to do an experiment. What I'm going to do is take two groups of people. Well, I'm going to take a group of people. I'm going to randomly assign them. Just with my number generator, you go in the group that spends time outdoors and you go in the group that spends time indoors. Then I'm going to have them spend time outdoors and indoors. Then I'm going to measure their depression. And if I find the outdoor people have less depression than the indoor people, in my experiment, I go, well, maybe being outdoors is causing a change in depression. So I'm starting to build a causal model. Does that make sense? So it's like, so you kind of go from things go together to things cause each other. And then what we do is we get a little more complicated. We go, why did that happen? So we say, yeah, being outdoors made you less depressed. Why is it? And your neuro guy goes, your buddy in neuro comes up and she's like, I think it's the serotonin's release from I don't know anything about this. Sorry. The solar energy goes into your eyes and makes serotonin happen with the magic serotonin maker. Well, that sounds like a pretty good model. And somebody else says, your friend that does social sciences, I bet if you're outside, there are a lot of people walking dogs. And I bet it's just the dogs that make people happy. It's doodles. It's just doodles. So they come up with their doodle model. And so you run your experiments. You say, well, is it the doodles that did it? Is it the brain magic juice that did it? And you kind of tease that stuff out. It's research for mechanisms, essentially for causation. So that's one thing. The other thing we spend a lot of time doing is, when does something happen? Can you turn it on and off? Oh, this works like this, but maybe I can turn it off by, maybe the sun will make you less depressed unless I make you read really bad poetry. That will help turn it off. So I get a bad poetry condition and turn it off. That's what we call moderation. So essentially what we're doing is, hey, we learn to measure these things. They go together. Here's why they go together. Here's the mechanism. And here's how I can turn it off, on and off. That's the moderation. That's science. We're building very, very simple models of a very complicated world. So I sometimes think of my job as I'm a personality psychologist. I think of my job as like making maps, like a cartographer. I make a map of the world. People are like, I'm going to go deal with people. Here, take my map of how people work. And they go out and use my map, and it's helpful a little bit, but then they get in certain places where my map isn't helpful. And I'm like, well, better get you another map for those places. So I build another map. So very much what we're doing is making these very simplified models of the world that we hope are useful. And we hope people use them to make other models. What we're not doing is figuring out how the world works perfectly and describing the whole damn thing. We're making simple models, not super complicated models, because we can't do that very well. So science is very small in a lot of ways. It's very limited what we're doing. So when they tell you they're a psychologist and they have stuff figured out, I would always question that. Usually the more you interact with the world, the less you realize you know. And anyway, so that's pretty much it. I guess the other thing to say that can be a problem is never fall in love with your own models, because it's just a darn model. So you make a model. What happens is mostly models are wrong. It takes me about 5 to 7 years to think something through. That sounds crazy, but that's about what it takes. So if I have to think something through, about 5 years of my life. If it's hard, 5 to 10 years. You can't just figure stuff out. Like a dissertation, a PhD is about 4 or 5 years of thinking about a topic, and you pretty much handle it. So this is a really long, slow process, and the world's really complicated. It's not like we got it figured out and can tell everybody. In terms of, quickly, like what the modern research psychology looks like, we tend to divide into fields, and they're often by levels of analysis, but it's not really perfect, because there's sort of applied psychology which is the psychology that we use in the world, and then there's more research psychology, which isn't applied. But I'll give you an example. So you go to any big research university, you're going to have some sort of basic experimental psychology that looks at something like rodents. You might call it behavioral neuroscience or something along those lines, looking at rats. You're going to have some sort of human neuroscience, maybe cognitive neuroscience. This is looking at people, often using scanners like an fMRI. You might have cognitive science or cognitive psychology, looking at things like memory, perceptual systems. You're probably going to have a social psychology group doing a lot of things about the self, social relationships, groups, prejudice, lots of these real social issues. You might have personality psychology looking at the self. And then in terms of applied fields, what you might have, and very likely to have, is clinical psychology, which most people are familiar with, which is training people to be clinicians, to go out and work and do work in psychology. Less common, but pretty common still, is industrial psychology. This is people who go into workplace psychology. So that'll be, so in a department, you'll have people working with rats and people getting dressed up to do corporate work. Just the same department, just at very different levels of analysis. So you have all those classic levels. Developmental, that's another classic field. So you have developmental. What's interesting is developmental goes across areas because it's about change. And applied areas are more focused on application. And then on top of that, you'll have neuroscience attached to everything now. So you might have cognitive neuroscience, social neuroscience, behavioral neuroscience. Do you have a lot of interest in neuroscience that's sort of appended to psychology? So you have all these different levels of analysis in sort of standard fields, each with their own organizations, their groups, their journals, et cetera. Another interesting way to break down psychology, and people don't think about it as much in the field, but I think it's useful, is maybe think about psychology coming from the inside and the outside. So, and this is just how I think of it. So outside psychology is this interest in understanding, predicting, and controlling behavior. This is the Skinnerians. Why are you doing psychology? I want to understand behavior so that I can predict behavior. And once I predict behavior, then I can control behavior. So this is learning psychology is a tool for manipulating people. Ideally to make the world better. I mean, it's not, you don't use these powers for bad, hopefully, but sometimes that happens. But that's how you're thinking about it. It's how I can control or shape people with psychology. And then there's inside psychology, which is the psychology of growth. This is what we're interested in when we read books at the airport and stuff. It's like, how do I as a person start where I am and grow into something more? Something like humanistic psychology. This is often what you're doing in clinical psychology, is trying to find out who you are and get better. You're doing this in the workplace with coaching. How do you find somebody who's a leader and you want to bring a leader into high performance? So there's an inside psychology about growth, outside about control. Both kind of different. And what I wanted to, wanted to just quickly tell you about myself, because just my own story in psychology, because I think this will help kind of make sense a little bit. My story is different than a lot of people, but similar to a lot of people as well. My interest in psychology came from philosophy and psychoanalysis. So I was just a kid in California, just reading Freud and reading a bunch of Buddhist books and reading Jung and reading a lot of old philosophy. I didn't understand science at all. And I was a terrible student. I took some good courses at Berkeley, but like I said, I was a terrible student. But I wanted to go into psychoanalysis. I thought that was a thing back then. I ended up meeting an analyst from Arkansas, fishing. He goes, I'm the last psychoanalyst in Arkansas. I'm an anachronism. He goes, I was an anachronism the day I got my degree. Well, I guess I'm not going to be a psychoanalyst. There are not many anymore, but that was my interest. So I got a master's degree at San Diego State, home of the Fighting Aztecs with a guy named George Matt, and I spent my time studying mood and memory. Most boring thing you can think of, but it was wonderful to me because that's when I learned how science worked. I learned essentially like you put people in certain moods and then you put them in the same mood, they remember things. Same. That's state-dependent memory. So I got into that, which was a little boring, but I wanted to study the self. And I got lucky and had a guy named Konstantin Sedekidis at the University of Wisconsin-Madison say, hey, come work in my lab, we'll study the self. And we're going to study how people enhance themselves and how people think they're a big deal. So I got into that work of the self-enhancement, and I started studying narcissism. And this is how it worked. People always like, why did you study narcissism? Well, I was at Yield Waffle Shop or Yield Pancake Shop in Madison, Wisconsin, and we were trying to figure out why some people are self-centered, SOBs, when they're with people they love, and why other people are pretty nice. And somebody said, hey, maybe it's narcissism. I thought, well, I'm a closet Freudian. It must be narcissism. Let's study narcissism. That's how I started doing it. It was just to figure that stuff out because I like Freud. So a lot of the stuff is just coincidence. I ended up doing it. So I did that. Then I did a postdoc at Case Western Reserve in Cleveland with a guy named Roy Baumeister, who's his genius in the field of psychology. And my job was on Tuesday nights, I go to his office over Lake Erie, I think. It was at Lake Michigan. I didn't get the lakes wrong. It's been so long. And his room was all covered with African masks. Oh, guy was so smart. He still is so smart. And he'd put on acid jazz and he'd go, let's talk about big ideas. So I was like a sparring partner. We'd talk about the nature of the world for 5, stay up till 2 in the morning. And I'd go home and do it again. It was great training. It was so much fun. That was a postdoc. Sorry, that you get your PhD. Then you spend 2 years just not getting paid, hanging out in Cleveland. And I really got into studying narcissism, and then I ended up at the University of Georgia, where I am now in Athens. I was at Chapel Hill, Wisconsin, Chapel Hill, Case Western. Then I've been at Georgia ever since. My work is mostly on things like narcissism and the self and self-enhancement. So I'm kind of interested in that. I have some weird interests. I'm interested in shamanic medicine. So I spent a lot of time studying ayahuasca. I study wealth. So I spent a lot of time studying wealth science. I do some other things too, but it's mostly the ego and the self and those kind of questions. I've worked with people that are more sociological, a lot of this science is a team sport. And so a lot of my work has been with a colleague named Jean Twangy, who's really interested in sociology. She's a postdoc with me. So we used to hang out in a basement in Cleveland talking about how the culture worked and talking about generational change and stuff. So I've been real lucky to work with her. I've got another colleague, Josh Miller, who's a clinical psychologist, a clinical personality psychologist, who's brilliant. So I was able to do a lot of clinical work. So people are like, are you a clinical psychologist? No, I don't talk to people. But I do a lot of work with really talented clinical people. And mostly, so that's what I do. I'm just kind of curious about stuff. The world is far more, I like questions more than answers. And if you ask me how the world was, 20 years ago, it's a lot more, I see it as much more complicated now than I did 20 years ago. I realize I know nothing. I used to think I was pretty smart. Like 18, I knew everything. Now I know nothing about the world. It's just awesome. Finally, I just wanted to wrap up here. I think the time is good. I wanted to say this to people. I hear people like, oh, I can't know the science. I'm not a scientist. Hell yeah, you can learn the science. It's not a massive secret. If you're interested in science, you can go directly. You don't have to listen to me. You go on something like Google Scholar, and you go and say, if you're interested in depression and sunshine, you go to Google Scholar, you type in depression, sunshine, review paper, or depression, sunshine, meta-analysis. Meta-analysis is basically a quantitative analysis of papers. You go in there and you find a meta-analysis that looks pretty recent, and you see how many people have cited it. And they'll say how many people cited, meaning they wrote a paper and referred back to that meta-analysis. You go, oh, there's a meta-analysis here that's been cited 100 times. That's where you start. And you read that. It's not that hard to get in the literature. The thing you're not going to be able to do if you're not a professional is you don't know when people are lying, and you don't know how people are shading the truth, because there's a lot of stuff in science where people are telling the story one way, and if you don't know the technical stuff, it's hard to see through it. But beyond that stuff, just reading the science, it's totally out there, and I'm just saying go for it. Just start reading papers. And you can find them. If you can't find them, you could email me, hey, can I have a copy of your paper? And I might even send it to you. Because no one asked me for my papers. And most academics gets, oh my God, somebody cares. Like, everyone hates me. This person in Guam loves my work. And they're very happy to share it. So I would just finish up by saying, I encourage you, whatever you're interested in, whatever you learn here, if you want to go for it, just go and read the original research yourself. Read the books. You don't have to listen to other people talking about it, because people who spend their life talking about other people's research, generally not people you want to listen to. People you want to listen to are doing it themselves.